The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, how a new organization is taking on the fight for election integrity. Ranked choice voting in Maine explained, plus why one Fox News reporter left the network and what he's doing now. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Sean McAlwee has spent half a decade bringing cutting-edge data analysis to progressive advocacy. His work has been cited by politicians at the national, state, and local level. And now, he's part of a new coalition to secure American elections without ever infringing on an eligible voter's right to vote. And we say hello to Sean McAlwee, a researcher and writer based in New York City and co-founder of Data for Progress, also a member of the advisory board of Secure Elections for America Now. Sean McAlwee, thanks very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure to have you with us. So you're on the advisory board of a brand new organization called Sean, Secure Elections for America Now. What's the vision?
The vision is we've had a lot of success with automatic voter registration and other pro-voting reforms. And what we need to do over the next several years is to buckle down and keep pushing forward. There are a couple of states like Connecticut and New York where we were a hair's breadth away from passing automatic voter registration. And we really want to make sure that next time those legislatures meet, that they commit to the promises that they've made and pass automatic voter registration.
Now, you're fighting on several fronts, from technology to outright political manipulation. Do you have a sense where the fight is going to be the toughest?
Sure. So, I think in a lot of ways, one of the harder things we're having, fighting back against the attempts to disenfranchise folks. So we've had big wins in Florida with the ballot initiatives, but we've already seen Republican governors working to roll that back. On the other hand, there are places where we've made progress. Something like automatic voter registration has been incredibly popular, even in red states like Alaska. People see how it makes the rolls cleaner and more correct. And that has, gains for both parties. You have more secure, more accurate, and more comprehensive voter rolls. So we have some policies where we're going to really have to be fighting. And there are a lot of other policies where we actually think that there can be a lot of progress made in the near future.
Now, we did just get a couple of major Supreme Court decisions related to elections, one on gerrymandering and the other on adding a citizenship question to the census. The court seems to be backing off from getting involved in either. Would you like to see the courts more involved in securing fair elections?
I think we'd all like to see the Supreme Court take a more aggressive role in pushing back against gerrymanders. And the purported reason they've done so, which is basically there's no good way to determine what a gerrymander is of course fundamentally incorrect. However, what we've seen is that gerrymandering is so wildly unpopular across the partisan spectrum that there's a lot of possibility moving forward with nonpartisan redistricting committees. Blessedly, the court has not struck those down. And to be honest, given that they're punting this to the state legislatures and to the direct democracy ballot process, it would be incredibly bad if they were to do so. So I think that while this is definitely not an ideal decision with regards to gerrymandering, we still have avenues going forward where we can we can make progress. And if I'm allowed to plug another project we're doing, Data for Progress and Crooked Media have teamed up on an anti-gerrymandering project where we are supporting and giving direct money to candidates who were previously in gerrymandered districts, and those districts are broken or were struck down by courts, or in places where we think that the partisan dynamics have moved enough that we can sort of break those gerrymanders. Because ultimately, with the court punting on this, the only way that we can break these gerrymanders is ultimately taking control. Of more and more states across the country, getting governors in place, getting at least one chamber of the legislature that allow us to have power to make sure that the gerrymander doesn't go through.
The thing that gets me, if the court doesn't take these issues and you leave it to the state, well, specifically with gerrymandering, you leave it to the state, that's like asking my cat to keep an eye on the fish, to me anyway. I mean, isn't that going to be an issue as well? Where, I mean, you're asking the states to police themselves, and that's where the problem begins.
Absolutely. I think that there's been a lot of success with real nonpartisan redistricting committees. Too often you get sort of sham committees that still end up producing negative results. But ultimately, I think one of the key paths forward is make this an issue in the election, only contribute to candidates who, are anti-gerrymandering candidates, and, continue to come up with new standards. We'll have more chances to shoot this down in the court. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is going to be having governors in place who can veto these and probably eventually just keep sending it back to courts until something has to be done. On the other decision you mentioned, the census decision, I think today was very good news. This was obviously, the battle's not over, but we've clearly made progress on that front.
Mm-hmm. Which is always a good thing. We're speaking with Sean McAlwee, researcher, writer based in New York City. He's co-founder of Data for Progress and a member of the advisory board of Secure Elections for America Now. And Sean, as we look around the country, we do see some legislative advances on elections as well as some backtracking. You kind of alluded to that earlier. On the advances side, we just saw Maine move to ranked choice voting across the board. Automatic voter registration is making headway. What and who is driving these successes?
Well, I think Maine has very specific Maine-based coalitions that have fought long and hard for this. And I think they've been able to weather several legal challenges at this point. Ranked choice voting really has to be considered up there as a serious democracy reform that should be taken seriously. And I think that parties should, as soon as possible, begin implementing ranked choice voting in their primaries. And I think cities, particularly cities where you have, real disproportionate partisan makeup, should start doing ranked choice voting there as well. It's a really great way to ensure that when you have a contest with multiple candidates, that is going to be a plurality vote. We have those a lot in New York, that there's a fair way to see that through. Automatic voter registration, there has been an incredible amount of energy coming from national organizations, groups like Indivisible that have come up after Trump's rise. Local groups in New York like Make the Road have been incredibly invested in this, and we're seeing it increasingly as a number one, number two issue at the state level for Democrats at this point. We see in a lot of states, the second the Democrats gain a trifecta, you have a lot of voters who want to see voting reforms be number one. Here in New York, we had a coalition called Let New York Vote. Really big umbrella coalition, had groups like Center for Popular Democracy, had groups like the ACLU join it, have moved mountains, and I think Susan Lerner deserves special credit for that work. And then we have some national umbrella groups like Indivisible who are really prioritizing this with their members.
And one of your major concerns is increasing voter turnout. And as we get further into the 2020 season, are you hearing the kinds of issues being discussed that could get voters to show up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for one thing, you have, Donald Trump on the ballot, an incredibly polarizing figure. That's no doubt going to drive turnout. You also have millennials who are very politically engaged, reaching sort of peak voting years. More and more settled down, sort of have gone through the process of voter registration, understand that, and are turning out at higher and higher rates. You also have, a presidential election in which you have a lot of choice on the Democratic side. That's going to draw interest in. And I think that you absolutely are seeing the issues that you're going to want to see for high care. Medicare for all is something that's on a lot of people's minds, the skyrocketing costs of prescription drugs. And now more and more climate is becoming a really central issue. Just last cycle, climate was barely mentioned in the Democratic primary debates. It still is not getting enough attention in the Democratic primary debates this year, but at least it is getting the 10 minutes it deserves, and ideally we'll see 20 minutes or 30 minutes in an upcoming debate.
We can only hope so, because that's long overdue as well. Sean McAlwee, co-founder of Data for Progress and member of the advisory board of Secure Elections for America Now, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Sean, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Absolutely. It's good to be on.
Thanks very much. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, better elections with ranked choice voting, the story from Maine. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Let us now contemplate the morality tale of the Good Samaritan. Not the one in the Old Testament, but the one out in the high desert region around Marfa, Texas, just 60 miles from the Mexican border. It's the story of Teresa Todd, the city attorney in Marfa. On February 27th, she was driving home on a dark road when suddenly 3 young Central American migrants desperately flagged her down. She could have just sped on, but the bedraggled migrants, 2 brothers and their sister, looked about the same age as Todd's own teenage boys, so she instinctively turned around and went back because, as she puts it, I can't leave a kid on the side of the road. Forced from their home by gang threats, the 3 refugees had become lost in the Texas desert, had run out of food and water, and the sister had fallen deathly ill. Putting them in her car, Todd was frantically trying to get medical help when, luckily, a sheriff's deputy pulled up behind them. But unluckily, the deputy was not there to help. He called the Border Patrol and turned the young refugees over to ICE. The officers confiscated Todd's purse, arrested her for suspicion of transporting illegal aliens, hauled her to a holding cell, and later seized her phone. It was totally surreal, she said. It still is. Even though she's not been formally charged, federal officials said the incident remains an active case, and they're still contemplating criminal charges against her. This is all about trying to chill the willingness of people to help others, Todd says. I'm simply a mom who saw a child in need and pulled over to try to help. During her ordeal, she says she kept thinking, what country am I in? This is not the United States. This is Jim Hightower saying, no indeed. It's Donald Trump's un-American, disunited state of autocracy. We need to build a wall around him.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Maine has been at the forefront of the movement to implement ranked choice voting, and Kyle Bailey has been a leader in that movement. He says it's a way to make democracy work better for all of us. And we say hello to Kyle Bailey, campaign manager for the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting 2020. Kyle Bailey, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. Our pleasure to be speaking with you. You know what? Why don't we start with you telling us, how does ranked choice voting work?
Well, it's a great question, and fortunately, it's pretty simple. So in races where you have more than two candidates, which is increasingly common, and we're actually seeing it right now in a crowded Democratic presidential primary with over 20 candidates, with ranked choice voting, you don't have to just pick one and or as we say, pick one and pray that your choice or acceptable choice rises to the top and wins with, 30 or 35% of the vote. But instead, you as a voter have the power to rank your choices in order of individual preference. So you walk into the voting booth and you get to say, this candidate's my first choice. But if that candidate couldn't win, I like this candidate, they're my second choice, and I can rank my third choice, and so on. And as a voter, you can rank as many or as few candidates as you like. And the tabulation process is just as simple. So ballots are counted in rounds where last place candidates lose until one candidate reaches a majority and wins. And you know that as a voter, if your first choice is eliminated, your vote isn't wasted. It counts for your second choice to help us all elect a consensus candidate who better represents voters as a whole.
And I guess this also gives the little guy, if you will, the person that's kind of the outlier when you've got, almost 24 candidates running, it gives them a better shot, I would think.
It absolutely levels the playing field for candidates who don't have the biggest bank accounts or who don't start out with the biggest name recognition. You've got a podium, you've got a voice, you've got an opportunity to get your message out. And that's really transformative of our politics. And it's one of the things that we can do right now to make our democracy work better for all of us, is to give not only voters more choices, but to give voters more voice in the political process.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've put a lot of time into seeing that ranked choice voting is adopted in Maine. What makes it the better way to vote?
Well, I would consider the current Democratic presidential primary. And I'd ask listeners to think about the race in this way. Do you want a nominee who unites the Democratic Party and who starts the general election in the strongest possible position to be able to reach out from day one in the general to independents and swing voters and win the presidency? Or are you willing to risk a divisive primary in which the eventual nominee might win with 30 or 35% of the vote and perhaps has to spend weeks or even months trying to justify their candidacy to certain parts of the base, trying to unite factions of the party behind their candidacy, well past the primaries and caucuses because they won without a majority, and there's concerns among the electorate of where they're vote splitting. Did so-and-so lose because they were splitting votes with so-and-so? And those sorts of questions arise when you have candidates win with less than 50% of the vote. And so ranked choice voting is an elegant solution to this problem of non-majority winners and the idea of vote splitting. And it allows those voters to really work together in a primary, in this case, to sort through the candidates and select a nominee who's supported by a strong majority of primary voters. And the rules are clear. There's no need for superdelegates to step in and pick a nominee. There's no vote splitting. Everyone gets their voices heard. And that's really some of the benefits of ranked choice voting in a race like a presidential primary that we're seeing play out right now.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's been reported, Kyle, that Maine is a poster child for the need for ranked choice voting. What does that mean?
Well, so we just talked about ranked choice voting as a great solution for a crowded primary. Now let's think about it for a general election where there's more than two candidates, which is common and increasingly common in the country, and it's been the case in Maine for decades. And we need to really look no further than the 2018 election for Congress in Maine's 2nd District. There were 4 candidates in that race in 2018. There was the incumbent Republican Congressman Bruce Poliquin, the Democratic challenger Jared Golden, and 2 other independent candidates. It was a 4-way race. In that election, on election night, the Republican incumbent Congressman Poliquin held a slight lead over the Democratic challenger, but the 2 independent candidates earned about 10% of the overall vote. Because that election was ranked choice voting and not pick one plurality, and we used that process of ranked choice voting in Maine in that election, what happened was voters got a chance to rank their candidates, first choice, second choice, and so on. So while Poliquin got the most votes or a plurality in the first round of tabulation, he failed to get an outright majority. So we had a instant runoff with ranked choice voting where ballots were counted in rounds. The last place candidates were eliminated. Those were the independents. And what we found was that by a 2-to-1 margin, voters who liked the eliminated independent candidates the best preferred the Democratic challenger over the Republican incumbent. And in fact, the Democrat ended up winning the race because of ranked choice voting. And it's because of ranked choice voting that voters didn't have to worry about vote splitting or the idea of wasted votes. They can walk into the voting booth, vote their hopes and not their fears, knowing full well that if their first choice was eliminated, their vote would count for their second choice, and that a candidate could not win who was opposed by a majority of voters. And those are the benefits of ranked choice voting in a real live election that we saw play out in Maine last year.
Yeah, I would think that for all the people that come out and say, I'm not going to vote because it doesn't make a difference. You don't have any, what difference does my one vote make? This would make your vote count a lot more.
Yeah, it makes everybody's voice heard more loudly because you get to walk into that voting booth and feel empowered to express your true preferences about each of the candidates. You don't have to worry about what the polls say, or who's viable, who is not. You get to actually vote for the person you think is best for the job. And if for some reason that person can't win, a majority of your fellow voters don't agree with you, it's not as if your vote was wasted or you helped to throw the election to someone you don't want because of vote splitting. You got a second choice, and your vote counts for them. So we all have our voices heard in a process of instant runoff with ranked choice voting that narrows down the field of candidates and elects a candidate more broadly who we can all sort of live with and know that is who a majority of us are most comfortable with representing us.
We're speaking with Kyle Bailey, campaign manager for the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting 2020. Kyle, even before Maine passed this legislation to use ranked choice voting for president, Maine became the first state to allow voters to use ranked voting in congressional elections. How did voters respond?
That's a great question. So Maine implemented ranked choice voting in 2018 for all primary elections and for federal races. So according to exit surveys and polls that were conducted by Maine newspapers and research institutions, voters reported that the process of ranking their choices was actually very easy. A strong and growing majority of voters support using it for elections. Anecdotally, I can tell you, in addition to that sort of data and those data sets which are available, I was attending one of the Democratic primary debates for governor in 2018. That was the first election round in which ranked choice voting was used in Maine. It was a 7-way race for the Democratic nomination for governor. And I was talking to voters before and after the debate. And what was so exciting was that intuitively voters started asking one another in these conversations, who are your top 3 choices? Who do you like first and who do you like second? And instead of adversarial and contentious conversations, what I heard was voters articulating their preferences and really engaging in meaningful dialogue about policy preferences and ideas and things that they actually liked about candidates, even those who weren't their first choice, instead of aggressive conversations or even perhaps avoiding conversations with someone who had a lapel sticker for another candidate. Because with ranked choice voting, you now want to talk to voters, who may have been wearing a lapel sticker for another candidate because that candidate may have been their first choice. but you've been able to have the opportunity to move them to support your candidate as their second choice. And that sort of constructive dialogue, I mean, it gave me goosebumps, and it gives me goosebumps still when I think about it, because it's so different than the way I've seen elections play out without ranked choice voting. And I think about the impact that could have in a presidential primary like the one going on now, or even a general election for president where you have multiple candidates. We have 6 states that are piloting ranked choice voting in the Democratic presidential primaries and caucuses in 2020, including the first in the nation Iowa caucus. And it's going to be really exciting, I think, and eye-opening for voters in those states and for voters who are watching the presidential race play out in those states to see the difference that ranked choice voting makes for the experience for voters and the healthy debate that ensues as a result of having this process in place among the candidates.
Well, and I can see how that's a feel-good moment for you to hear and to be listening in on those conversations that are just nice, thought-out conversations and people discussing politics in that way. But I know it's also been a hard fight for you. Can you describe some of the ups and downs of your campaign?
Well, how much time do you have? So we have ranked choice voting in Maine as a result of 2 ballot measure campaigns. So the first, we started collecting signatures in 2014. It was on the November 2016 ballot. It was a citizens initiative. And in that campaign, voters rejected the old pick one system and replaced it with ranked choice voting. We then had a second referendum campaign, a people's veto campaign, to restore this voter-approved law after Maine's previous legislature actually repealed it. And so we won both campaigns. We also won multiple legal battles in state and federal courts that upheld ranked choice voting as fully constitutional. We were able to defend the law and actually had to force at times the state election officials to implement it. So to say it was hard was an understatement, but I'll give you just one example of how hard it was that was also, I think, inspiring for me in leading these campaigns. So on the second campaign, the People's Veto campaign to restore the law after the legislature repealed it, our opponents actually timed their repeal and therefore our initiative. So we only had 90 days to collect 80,000 signatures, and we had to do it in the middle of one of the coldest winters on record in Maine. Now, for those who haven't been to Maine, we are a geographically large state with a small population that's really spread out across the state. So most signature petition campaigns in our state actually fail to get their signatures. And those are campaigns that have the warm summer months to collect signatures when Mainers are out and about. We didn't have that luxury. But I'll tell you, within 24 hours of our People's Veto being approved, we put petition forms in the hands of 500 volunteers and collected over 35,000 signatures in the first 24 hours of our People's Veto drive. And within 2 weeks, we had nearly 2,000 volunteers collecting signatures, and we submitted well more than what was needed to place us on the ballot. And these volunteers were Maine people, and many of whom I can tell you had never been involved in campaigns before. And they were extraordinary, and they stood out in sub-zero temperatures, in layers of clothes, and feet of snow to get the signatures that we needed one by one to put our People's Veto on the ballot and protect the law that we worked so hard to win. And to be a part of something that's so people-powered, and that is the magic behind ranked choice voting, is what it does for a voter and their experience in our politics and changing the culture of our politics. Invites new people to participate in the process. Not only do we see higher voter turnout with ranked choice voting, but people are really engaged in the process, and people came out of the woodwork to work on these issues, this issue in Maine, and to make these initiatives happen. And that was really incredible to be a part of and to see.
Yeah, that really speaks volumes. All right, now before we let you go, Kyle, what are the national implications of your victory?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, 6 states are going to be using ranked choice voting in the Democratic primaries and caucuses this year. Massachusetts looks to be putting a ballot measure on in 2020. Other states may follow suit. And so what we see is Maine is the first state to implement ranked choice voting statewide, to do it successfully. And now there's a model for other states to follow. And I'd also, in terms of implications for the victory, for what it means for America and our country, the largest block of voters in our country, today aren't Democrats, they aren't Republicans, they aren't even independents, they're non-voters. And they're people who are young and old, male and female, gay and straight, black and white. They don't feel like their voices are being heard, and they've opted out of the political process. And we can and should make it easier for them to vote with same-day and automatic voter registration, early voting, vote by mail. We should fix gerrymandering and money in politics. But even if we did all those things, which are really important, we haven't actually changed the underlying rules of our democracy that expressly prohibit or make it nearly impossible for voters to have more than two meaningful choices. So we can continue to do what we've done for a long time, which is to make laws that try to silence or sideline different voices and be glad that only 50% of Americans have opted out of participating in elections. Or we can change the underlying rules to give voters more meaningful choice in elections. And to do it, I think, in a very American way that gives we the people the power to rank our choices, encourages healthy and constructive competition and debate about issues, not personalities, and that results in consensus winners who are beholden only to us. That's how we not only get more people to vote, but it's how we win them back to being truly engaged citizens who work with us collectively to strengthen our democracy for future generations and to make our union more perfect. And that is the power of ranked choice voting.
And it is sorely, sorely needed right now. Kyle Bailey, campaign manager for the Committee for Ranked Choice Voting 2020. Kyle, thank you so much for your time with us today. Look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Sounds great. Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with journalist Carl Cameron about life after Fox News and why he launched a new progressive website called Front Page Live.
Over 2 decades with Fox News as a principal political reporter out on the campaign trail, how much time did you spend on the road?
Way too much for mental, physical, spiritual health. There were times when I would start chasing presidential campaigns in the preceding cycle's run-up to the midterms.
Whoa.
So in this case, recently, we'd be talking about going out on the road in 2017 before the 18 midterms. And I did that virtually every year from 1995 on.
And
every cycle.
And several presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, the whole thing.
So more often than not, I spent more time on the road than I did in either New York or D.C. Fox studios or my own home.
It was a good gig. You got a great reputation for it, well-deserved. Why'd you quit?
Because I was burned out. I was exhausted. I had been on with Trump since prior to 2014, and everything about his nomination and about his candidacy and his presidency and his lack of preparedness was really, really bearing down on me mentally and philosophically. I don't have a particular penchant for the Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Green, or other of the 93 some odd parties who have been on our national ballot since the beginning of the country's time. But I do have a penchant for the principles and the values on the country and how it was founded, and how we have corrected some of our mistakes along the way. And with Donald Trump, I saw nothing but mistakes. Long before he ever ran for president this last time, I covered him in '88 when he ran, and I covered him in 2000 when he ran. And that's one of the things that aggravated me from the very beginning, because his origin story was that he'd never been a politician and never run for office, and he was a successful businessman, and he is neither.
Someone told me just recent as this morning, when they knew I was going to be talking to you, that all those years watching you on television, reporting on the campaigns, never had any idea of what your personal politics or personal belief was.
Good. That pleases me. That was the point. And I stung a few Republicans and I stung a few Democrats, made a handful of mistakes along the way, but I also gave them credit where credit was due. And that's the point, particularly for a political reporter. We are supposed to inform the public so that they can make responsible decisions in whatever suits their fancy at an election point. It's not like a beat police job reporter. It's different. I am giving you information that you're going to act on as opposed to just be aware of. So There's not a lot of margin for BSing that, and there's too much of it everywhere because news has become, for most people, a consumer product that is entertainment, not information.
So was part of your frustration not just with Donald Trump, but with the network you were working for?
Sure. I was always left alone to do what I wanted to do. I was lucky to have been hired before the network launched, along with Shepard Smith and Eric Shawn, both of whom are still there. And for the people in the news department, I have tremendous respect for their perseverance and their attempt to be accurate and to be fair. But there was no secret and there is no secret, and it has been acknowledged in their own press reporting over the years, that the news division and the entertainment side of Fox often have friction. That should be with any operation. The news department is supposed to be a pain in the neck. It's expensive, it's hard work, and you got to get it right, and you got to keep your own opinions out of it. But that's not what's happening anymore. It's too easy to put on 30 seconds of actual news and 8 minutes of paneled experts, because that can be more entertaining than another story or more information on the story. So people will stay there till we run our Geico ads.
Right. But several people have said that today Fox News is nothing more than an extension of the Trump White House. Do you believe that?
No, but I do think that it is probably the first time in the age of television that there's ever been a president and a news department or a news provider that has been this close to a president. We all know that LBJ used to love to sit down and have quiet, off-the-record meetings with his buddies and play cards and smoke cigars and drink a little bit. That didn't change how they reported. Access is a problem. Access for journalists. I think the best example of that was the crisis that became the absence of weapons of mass destruction in the Iraq War. Had Judy Miller not had access to the Vice President of the United States, her editors would not have let a lot of what she was writing go on. Had Judy Miller not had access to a Vice President who was saying that there were weapons of mass destruction and the CIA was concealing it from the public, and all that stuff, that access would not have, without that access, we wouldn't have had that lie perpetuated across the world by one of the most revered newspapers that we have. So that's a problem, and it affects all of us. And so we shouldn't be that close to the leaders we cover. It's as simple as that. I have two grown boys, grown men now, but when they were kids, there was no way I was ever going to have my kids interact with some politician's kids. Not as a social thing. It just wasn't. It was just too close.
So today you have a case where Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, who knows who else, almost daily talk to the President of the United States, influencing public opinion. That healthy?
I don't think so. I think they do. I think the three of them think that they're actually doing the right thing. I disagree. And I have no problem with opinion people. I don't. I mean, I have my own opinions, and some of them I'm willing to share, but it's got to be based on some sort of historical fact. There has to be some artifact that makes it real, as opposed to an aspirational goal or just ideological.
So would you consider Fox News today as a legitimate news channel, or is it fake news?
No, well, fake news is nonsense. That's an oxymoron. Fake and news in the same places. Either it's news or it's not. Either it's accurate or it isn't. I'm not going to perpetuate Trump's nonsense. I think all media has a responsibility to be accurate and to be informed. Anything short of that is misleading the public. You seek to put their eyeballs in front of our cameras. And anything other than that, eventually, I think it's just fundamentally destructive. And frankly, I mean, let's be flag wavers here for a minute. George Washington supposedly never told a lie. America is supposed to be about helping people and doing the right thing. Giving people misinformation or giving them falsehoods, intentionally or not, needs to be corrected, not enhanced. It needs to be stopped, not enhanced. and TV is a business. And so being on the web provides different opportunities. It's a way bigger problem of nonsense and lies on the web than there is on television. So Front Page Live is going to tackle that, and what we're doing is putting out stuff that does have an appeal for progressives, for liberals, for Democrats, for people left of center. But the fact of the matter is I've gotten a lot of feedback from folks who are surprised to find me working at a progressive place because they were Campaign Carl fans when I was at Fox, and they seem to like it too, because they believe that it's factual. And these are stories that we're aggregating from across the webosphere, and they're all, if they're trending, if they're going viral, if they're accurate, we will put those into the mainstream and hopefully have a huge audience of people who have been better informed, as opposed to having their biases fortified by more biased misinformation.
And you're talking about your new venture, Front Page Live.
FrontPageLive.com. FrontPageLive.com, FrontPageLive.com. It's a good thing it's on tape because you can cut that out.
FrontPageLive.com.
I hope you don't.
We want to help you promote it. Before we move on to that, I want to come back to Fox News for a second, just to ask you about it and get your reaction to either a couple of players or a couple of programs. If you're talking about the Trump White House being an extension of Fox News, maybe that's no more true, or would you agree that's no more true than with Fox and Friends in the morning?
Yeah, I think that they are obviously supporting him. That's part of the language. That's part of their vernacular. They are making it very clear that they are Trump boosters.
He watches them. Right. He retweets them. Right. He's even changed his opinion based on what he saw on Fox and Friends in the morning.
True. And now Trump has criticized Chris Wallace and Brett Baer and a variety, and Shepard Smith quite a bit, and again, that sort of makes my point. There is a news division there that is actually getting under his skin. That is a good thing, if for no other reason, because he'll go after anybody. He says loyalty is his primary goal out of people. He has no loyalty to anything other than himself. He claims to love Fox, but he'll take a shot at the first possible slight.
How'd you get along with Roger Ailes?
Roger didn't hire me, actually. He wasn't there when I got hired. Joe Perrinan, the ex-boss at CBS, was the guy who came in. And Emily Rooney, Andy's daughter, Andy Rooney was the director of the political unit that was formed prior to the launch. Back in 94 and 5, Rupert Murdoch said that his Fox broadcast stations needed to start having news operations if they didn't already have one. Some of the O&Os did, but most of the Fox channels around the country didn't have news. And he literally invented the 10 o'clock newscast. And so the 10 o'clock newscast needed a news feed, so they hired Shepard to do natural disasters and crime stories, Eric to do all that was going on in Washington, D.C., me, the kid from New Hampshire in the first primary state, having worked at Channel 9, where we met years and years and years ago.
Yes.
To cover the primaries. That was Bill Clinton's reelection and Bob Dole. So they hired me, and there was about 75 people in our and what we were doing was feeding the local affiliates for the broadcast network, and then we launched. And so it goes way, way back for me. And in the early stages, it was crazy how over the top Fox went to prove that it was trying to be accurate. The banners across the bottom didn't just say opinion. It said, so-and-so is from such an organization. This organization leads by such and, it leans in such and such a way, and it gets funded by Y. I mean, it was like extremes amounts of money, of information that was being put on the screen so that people would understand the opinion that they were hearing had some sort of an underlying agenda. That's long since gone.
Right. Did you, you ended up working or knowing Roger Ailes?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Supported your work?
He did. He used to love to say that one of his longtime associates, a guy named Chet Collier, when he first saw me on TV, he said, "I don't like that guy. He doesn't pop." And I was told about that over and over and over again by Roger. And I said, "Well, you didn't hire me because of my looks in the first place. So, it's because of politics." And it was because, I was straight. I wasn't trying to make a point for myself. I wasn't trying to self-aggrandize. Having started my career and having worked in news and gotten to know the first-in-the-nation political ethos in the Granite State, live free or die, people in New Hampshire have the first primary vote for president. The candidates running don't vote in New Hampshire. So we say to you, Mr. Candidate, I'm the guy who votes. You're a guest here. Impress me. You can't vote here. And that's how I became a political reporter, with that New Hampshire attitude of we're the first in the nation, we're the ones who are going to start the real ball rolling for president. We have a responsibility to really give these guys a lot of shit and see what, or women too, and see what they're made of and how they react. And it's a marvelous thing to see. I know you've been up there and you've seen it before. It is like a carnival of politics in the last 2 weeks before the primary. Right. And every Granite Stater thinks they're more important than a president, and they're right.
And they're not willing to vote for them until they've shaken everybody's hand 5 times.
So, Roger, there was one instance where there was a bit of a gaffe when the Obama administration was very, very angry because someone at Fox on the entertainment side had said that Obama, when he was with his mother in Indonesia, had attended a madrasa. And they demanded a retraction and a correction on that. And ultimately, I ended up, because I was close to the Obama campaign, I was close to the Obama administration, because I'd known all the operatives for years, I was able to put together and help Ailes and others, including, I think Murdoch was involved at one point, in order to get Roger Ailes and Barack Obama in a room alone and work it out. And it was like a 90-minute meeting. And they did. And it didn't last very long, but for a while there was a peace. And there was a collaboration where the entertainment people at Fox were not quite as cutthroat as they had been.
You have moved from into a new operation. You mentioned Front Page Live, frontpagelive.com. Goal is to do what?
A couple things.
And how do you do it?
The elevator pitch is that that there's a new frontier and a new opportunity, really, for the left to be more effective online. Part of the model is really kind of like the Drudge Report, a very simple, very skimmable way to get updated on all the stories that are the most important at that given moment. This, unlike the Drudge Report, will not deny climate science, will not push agendas that divide people rather than and be helpful and productive and move the country forward. This will be about ideas that will be of change. Conservatives have change ideas too. Not all conservative and not all ideas from the right are bad, but the leadership right now, whether it's at the White House or in Congress, is desperately messed up. And partly because the Republicans don't know how to handle Trump, because he's not really a Republican, and partly because Trump likes that chaos because he doesn't know what to do next, so chaos is his standard go place. That has to change. And so Front Page Live has the opportunity to really make a difference with that.
Is it up and running?
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely it's up and running. In fact, I'm going to knock on wood here, we're doing better than we expected. And I mean, I'm trying to keep my expectations low, but the feedback has been very positive, and I'm surprised by the feedback that I've gotten from friends from my days at Fox, who are calling up and sending me texts and emails and everything else that are all like, "Hey, good for you. This thing looks awesome, and it looks good, and and I bookmarked it." So if fellow journalists are interested in it, that to me is like, okay, we're doing something right already.
Is your goal to be the Drudge Report from the left, or the Drudge Report with the facts?
The Drudge Report with the facts, absolutely. But the left, the progressive and liberal ideas have been fighting with one hand, if not one hand and one full arm behind their backs since the dawn of the digital age. Republicans jumped on the web from the very beginning. You remember Free Republic.
Sure.
The only thing that ever, and then came Drudge, and if you take a look at the top news-oriented ideological web pages, the top 10 are all Republican. When you look for, quote, liberal media outlets, you get things like NBC and the New York Times. That's not what we're talking about. Front Page Live is progressive and liberal. There will be a lot of that in there, but the information is accurate. So both sides are going to want to watch it, particularly Republicans who know that their president is not going to be easy to reelect if he keeps doing the kind of crap he's doing right now.
Bill Press talking with Carl Cameron, chief political correspondent, Front Page Live. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressShow.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Sean McAlwee, Kyle Bailey, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.